I thought the worst part would be ending up in a prison cell, but it turned out the worst part was looking in the mirror every day and knowing I didn't lie to them. I lied to myself. The prosecutor gave me a choice: 5 years for a lie or 50 for the truth. And I chose the lie, because back then, 5 years felt like survival. But now I know you can survive 50, but only if you're clean, and I will never be clean again, even if I'm free now. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Elaine Martin. I was 59 years old when the fluorescent ceiling buzzed above my head like an insect too stubborn to die. I had been a corporate accountant for nearly 3 decades, first in Seattle, then in Portland. Numbers had been my refuge, their clean, impartial logic sheltering me from the chaos of human error. But on that day, in that room without windows, logic abandoned me. They brought me in through a side hallway that smelled faintly of burned coffee and something colder, like concrete that had never seen the sun. The linoleum floor was polished to a shine, but nothing about it felt clean. I was seated at a table that had been wiped too many times. The wood veneer had peeled at the edges, revealing layers of wear like tree rings. A chair was pulled out for me. I sat. There were no clocks in that room, no windows, no way to mark time, which made every second stretch like chewing gum pulled between fingers. A small surveillance camera blinked in the corner. I didn't know if it was recording or just there to remind me that someone might be watching. I couldn't decide which was worse. The air conditioning was turned up too high. I wore a wool blazer over a blouse, but I still felt the chill bite through the fabric. I folded my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. Not from fear exactly, at least not the kind of fear I could name. It was more like a hollowness spreading in my chest, eating at the edges of my breath. The door opened with a gentle click. He didn't slam it or stride in dramatically. That would have been easier. Instead, he walked in like a man entering a church, quietly, respectfully, with practiced solemnity. He set down a thin stack of papers, a pen, and a styrofoam cup of coffee across from me. The coffee steamed faintly, the only warm thing in the room. He told me his name. I forgot it immediately. He didn't threaten me, not directly. He spoke the way doctors do when they deliver terminal news. Calm, concise, as if removing all emotion made it easier to digest. He explained that I had been implicated in a wire fraud case involving my former employer, a transportation logistics firm I'd worked at for 9 years. He said the evidence was complicated, but sufficient. He said my signature had appeared on documents that had moved large sums of money into shell accounts. I had no idea what he was talking about. I remembered quarterly reports, payroll reconciliations, reimbursement forms for fuel expenses. I remembered staying late during audit season, drinking bad tea and triple-checking every line item because I hated mistakes. I remembered correcting a decimal point once that saved the company $37. That was the kind of accountant I was. But they had bank statements, emails, a timeline. They had a former colleague who had agreed to cooperate. They had a narrative, and I was part of it. I opened my mouth once, maybe twice, but no sound came out. He wasn't asking me to explain. He was offering me a deal. 5 years in federal prison if I agreed to plead guilty to misprision of felony, concealing knowledge of a crime, not committing it, not profiting from it, just knowing, just not telling. The alternative was worse. They would escalate the charges, wire fraud, conspiracy, tax evasion, obstruction of justice. If they pursued all counts and I lost, which, he explained, was extremely likely, I could face 50 years, effectively a life sentence. I glanced at the coffee. The steam had stopped rising. He asked if I understood. I nodded. My voice had folded itself into some corner of my throat I couldn't reach. He slid the papers toward me. The pen followed with a soft scrape. I stared at the line where my name was typed, Elaine L. Martin. I had always hated the middle initial. It stood for Louise, my mother's name, and we hadn't spoken in years. But there it was, on the line where my freedom would end. I didn't sign, not then. He told me to take the night, that I could call a lawyer, though he warned me about the risks of trial again. He said it gently, with experience, as if he had watched dozens, hundreds, make this same choice before, as if the room itself had seen it all. I walked back to the holding area, escorted by a deputy whose eyes never met mine. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. I passed a poster peeling from the wall that read, in blue block letters, "Justice isn't a result, it's a process." That night, I sat on the cot in my holding cell and stared at the floor for hours. The concrete was stained in places I didn't want to imagine. The air was thick with bleach and loneliness. I thought of my daughter, who hadn't called in weeks. I thought of my ex-husband, who had remarried a woman named Karen with 2 dogs and a kayak. I thought of the woman I used to be, before the gray hair, before the false accusations, before this cold room without windows. In the morning, they brought me back. The same room, same chair, same papers. This time, I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. My heart did. I wrote my name in blue ink, block letters, deliberate, controlled, and with that, the truth I had held so tightly, so stubbornly, slipped from my hands like sand, not because it was false, but because it was no longer useful. Because in that room without windows, justice had no place, only strategy, only math. 5 years. I told myself it was better than 50. But even then, a quiet voice whispered from some deep place in me I couldn't shut out. 5 years for a lie, or 50 for the truth. And I had chosen the lie. The paper was ordinary, standard letter size, crisp, white, with a faint watermark that caught the light when I tilted it. Nothing about it looked dangerous. It was just a piece of paper. But when they placed it in front of me, it took on the weight of 1,000 bricks. A simple rectangle of ink and cellulose, yet it felt like a verdict already rendered. I was sitting in another cold room, not the same as before, but similar enough that my body reacted the same way. Tight shoulders, clenched stomach, the taste of iron at the back of my throat. There was no clock here either, no window to offer escape or illusion of time. The lights were too bright, humming faintly overhead. I rubbed my hands together, not from cold, but from the dread crawling under my skin. The man across the table was different this time, not the first one. This one was younger, with a smoother voice, like someone used to negotiating corporate contracts or selling cars. He smiled occasionally, but it didn't reach his eyes. I couldn't decide whether he was pretending or simply didn't care. He laid the document down between us like a sacred offering, told me it was the official plea agreement, that once I signed, things would move quickly. He said the judge would likely accept it, that the sentencing would be straightforward. He used words like streamlined, expedited, predictable, as if my life had become a shipment on a conveyor belt, one more item to be processed, labeled, and delivered to its destination. I looked at the paper. It had my name on it, printed in bold at the top, right beneath the seal of the U.S. District Court. The font was impersonal, mechanical. It reduced me to case number, date of birth, and charge, misprision of felony, a phrase I had never spoken aloud before all of this began, now branded into my vocabulary like a burn. The language was clinical, knowingly concealed knowledge of a federal offense, willfully failed to notify the proper authorities, agreed to accept responsibility. Each sentence was a quiet dagger. I traced the lines with my eyes, unable to lift my hands. It felt like reading my own obituary, written in passive voice. I imagined briefly what it would feel like to tear it in half, to crumple it up and throw it across the room, to scream that I hadn't done anything, that the accounts weren't mine, that the transfers weren't my responsibility, that I had simply done my job. But I didn't move. My hands remained folded in my lap, palms damp with sweat. He pointed to the signature line, told me I could use the pen on the table. It was a cheap black ballpoint, the kind that skips if you don't press hard enough. I picked it up and stared at the ink tip, wondering how something so small could mark such a permanent line between before and after. There was a line in the agreement that said, "This plea is made voluntarily and of the defendant's own free will." I read that sentence 5 times. Voluntarily, of my own free will. And yet I felt no freedom in that room, only the narrowing of options until there was only one road left, and even that one was barely wide enough to walk. I had asked for a few minutes alone. They granted it. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. I was alone with the paper and my silence. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling, at the recessed lights embedded in the acoustic tile. One of them flickered every few seconds, breaking the rhythm like a warning I didn't understand. I remembered a time, years ago, when my daughter had forged my signature on a permission slip to skip gym class. I found out when the school called. I had been furious, not because she skipped, but because she had signed my name. I told her a signature meant something. It was a promise, a declaration, a choice you couldn't take back. Now I was about to do the same. When they returned, I was still holding the pen. He asked if I was ready. I nodded, though every part of me wanted to scream. My hand moved on its own, disconnected from the woman inside who had once believed in fairness, due process, the system. I pressed the pen to the paper and wrote my name, each letter shaky but legible. Elaine Louise Martin. When I finished, I let the pen roll away from my fingers. It clicked softly against the table and spun to a stop. He took the paper, glanced at it, and nodded. It was done. They photocopied it. One copy for me, one for the court. They handed me mine in a manila envelope. I didn't open it. I didn't need to see the copy to know what it said. I could feel the shape of it burning through the paper like acid. That night, back in the holding cell, I took it out. I read it again, slowly, under the dim fluorescent light that never turned off. Each word was heavier than before. I pressed my fingers to the page, as if trying to pull something back from it. But the paper didn't change. It didn't care. That piece of paper had rewritten my entire life. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a surrender. And though the ink was dry and the signature was mine, the person who had written it no longer felt real. She was someone I used to be, and I wasn't sure who I had become. Time inside prison did not move in days or weeks. It moved in sounds. In footsteps at 6 a.m. that meant lights on. in the distant buzz of a door unlocking, in the voice over the loudspeaker calling names like lottery numbers, in the scraping of plastic utensils on metal tables. The calendar was not marked with red circles or X. It was made of repetition, erosion, the gradual wearing down of everything that once felt sharp inside me. I arrived at the federal facility just after dawn. The sky was bruised gray, low clouds sagging as if the heavens themselves felt the weight of it. The van ride had been silent except for the hum of tires and the occasional click of the driver's tongue against his teeth. I had stared at my hands the whole way. The same hands that once balanced spreadsheets and typed tax filings were now cuffed together like a warning. They took my coat and my clothes and handed me a uniform the color of old carrots. The fabric was rough, institutional, with seams that scratched at the skin. I had never worn anything like it. I folded my blouse and pants slowly, reverently, as though folding a life I would not see again. I was assigned to Dorm C, Unit 4B, a double-tiered pod with 24 women, most of them already awake when I walked in. My bedding pressed against my chest like a shield. The air smelled like bleach, damp towels, and something sour beneath it. Someone glanced up from a bunk, then back down. No one spoke. No one needed to. I was just another name, another body, another inmate with a backstory no one asked about. My bunk was on the upper tier. Metal frame, thin mattress, a pillow filled with something that felt like compressed lint. I climbed the ladder slowly, the sheets tucked under my arm. My whole body felt like it had been stuffed with wool, heavy, muffled, slow. I made my bed carefully because it was the only thing I could control. Tight corners, smooth surface, blanket folded to regulation. I hadn't made a bed like that since my mother barked orders down a hallway in our Wisconsin farmhouse. That first night, I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling, painted a pale institutional cream. The light above the door never went off completely. It cast a soft yellow halo across the pod, enough to make shadows move, enough to keep your thoughts awake. I could hear breathing, sniffling, someone murmuring in sleep, the creak of a bed frame as someone turned. I counted those sounds like clock ticks. Days became numbers. Day 1, orientation, a packet of rules, procedures, and codes. Day 4, assignment to laundry duty. Day 9, first commissary purchase, a notebook, a small pencil, toothpaste that tasted like chalk. Day 17, mandatory mental health intake. The woman who interviewed me had kind eyes, but never looked directly into mine. She asked questions like a checklist. I answered like a stranger in my own body. I learned the rhythm. The morning count at 6 yo. Breakfast trays with powdered eggs and gray sausage at 6:30. Job assignment at 7 nay. Count again at noon. Lunch at 12:30. Afternoon movement. Dinner at 5 a. Lock in at 9 a. Lights out at 10 say, though no one truly slept then. We lived in the space between those numbers, between the buzzers and announcements, the space where memory tried to breathe. I watched a woman cry into her soup one night. She didn't make a sound. Her tears just slid down her cheeks and into the tray. I didn't ask why. We never did. That was an unspoken law. Don't ask. Don't explain. I followed it like scripture. I kept my head down, did my shifts in laundry, folded uniforms that never seemed to dry fully, their damp weight hanging in my arms like regret. Every 2 weeks, we got 20 minutes of phone time. I tried calling my daughter once. It rang and rang, then voicemail. I left a message. I never heard back. I didn't try again. Instead, I wrote letters I didn't send. To her, to myself, to the life that had existed before the plea deal, before the paper, before the cell. I wrote them in the notebook I kept under my mattress, next to the paperback novel I never finished. The pages filled with small, neat handwriting, each line a whispered reminder that I had once belonged to a world with color, with texture, with warmth. Seasons changed, but inside, the air stayed the same. We marked holidays not by decorations, but by the altered menu. Turkey slices in November, dry chocolate cake in February, plastic candy canes in December. I took none of them. Holidays made people weep, and I didn't want to start. Once you cried in that place, it was hard to stop. Some women counted down. "I've got 16 months left," one said. "3 Christmases to go," another whispered. But I couldn't bring myself to measure time that way. I stopped counting days. I started counting loads of laundry, stacks of sheets, footsteps between my bunk and the day room. Time wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about survival, about not letting the silence carve too deeply into you. Once, a woman in my unit was released. She packed her things in a pillowcase, walked out quietly. No goodbyes, no celebration, just a sudden vacancy, a bunk left cold. I sat on my mattress that night and stared at the place where her blanket had creased. The emptiness felt louder than any argument. I began waking up before the lights came on. Something in me adjusted, like a clock wound to the new time zone of captivity. I would open my eyes in the soft dark and wait for the click of the latch, the flicker of fluorescence, the voice calling out numbers. That was my calendar, the space between the waking and the noise, the place where I still existed. Years slipped into each other, not whole years, fragments, slivers, like shards of a broken mirror I could never reassemble. I stopped looking at my reflection in the polished metal above the sink. I didn't recognize the face, too hollow, too quiet, but sometimes when folding sheets, I'd hum under my breath, old songs, hymns, bits of jazz from my father's records. The other women didn't mind. Some joined in. Music was safer than stories. It filled the air without asking questions. I lived inside that rhythm for 5 years, 5 long, soundless, structured years, measured not in calendars, but in the rituals of survival. I folded, I counted, I waited, and I never forgot the paper that had brought me there. Because every fold of every sheet reminded me, this place had not been built for guilt. It had been built for the convenient, and I had allowed myself to become that. When the day came, it arrived without fanfare. No brass keys jingling, no guards exchanging knowing glances, no celebratory words. Just a quiet knock on the metal frame of my cell and a short nod from a woman whose name I never learned, though I had seen her pass my bunk nearly every day for the past half-decade. Her face carried the kind of blankness that came from repetition. Another name on the list, another body to be released, another time slot to be kept on schedule. I folded my blanket carefully, not because it was needed, but because my hands didn't know what else to do. The cot beneath me was bare before I even stood. I had packed the night before, though there was little to take. A paperback novel with a torn cover, a toothbrush dulled to rubber, a bundle of letters I had never sent. All of it fit into a clear plastic bag, sealed with tape like evidence. The hallway outside the unit smelled different, less of bodies and disinfectant, more of fresh paint and varnish. Or maybe I just imagined it, wanting it to feel like something had changed. The light overhead flickered slightly as I walked. my footsteps muffled against the worn linoleum. No one said goodbye. Some women lifted their eyes as I passed, but none spoke. We were ghosts to each other, visible only in motion, forgotten in absence. The final corridor had no windows, just a series of closed doors and pale cinder block walls that absorbed the sound of everything. It reminded me of the office building where I had worked before all of this, though cleaner. The irony settled in my throat like a stone. I used to work in places like this. Now I was being escorted out of one. Same architecture, different verdict. The release room was small, quiet, with a single bench and a metal counter. The officer behind the glass asked for my ID number, then handed me a small envelope with my name scrawled in thick blue ink. Inside were the items I had carried when they arrested me: a silver watch no longer ticking, a faded driver's license with a face that looked more awake, a keychain with a single house key that now opened nothing. My clothes were in a plastic bin. The blouse had yellowed around the collar. The slacks had a crease I didn't remember ever making. I dressed slowly, methodically, buttoning each button as though threading the needle back through time. They gave me $50 in cash and a bus voucher. No phone, no escort, just instructions spoken in the same flat tone I had come to expect. I stepped toward the exit, half expecting an alarm to go off, some last-minute reversal, a voice to shout that it had all been a mistake. But there was nothing, just a door, and it didn't creak. It swung open silently, precisely, with that unnatural smoothness only institutional hinges ever possess. No final clang, no dramatic slam, just a soft hush as it released me back into the world. The air outside was cool, not cold, not warm, just sharp enough to sting the inside of my lungs. The sky was the kind of blue you only see in early morning, still pale at the edges, the sun not yet fully committed to the day. I stepped onto the pavement and paused, letting my shoes touch the ground without bars around them for the first time in years. The earth felt foreign, tilted. There was no one waiting. I hadn't told anyone the exact date, not because I didn't want to be greeted, but because I didn't want to be disappointed. 5 years was enough time for people to drift, to grow used to your absence, to rewrite the narrative of your worth. It was easier to step out alone than to wait for faces that would never appear. I walked toward the bus stop just outside the facility. The bench was damp with dew, the metal cold beneath my thighs. I sat with the plastic bag in my lap, its contents shifting with every breath. Across the street was a gas station with a flickering open sign and a clerk drinking coffee behind fogged-up glass. A woman in a blue hoodie walked her dog along the sidewalk, unaware of me, unaware of everything. I wasn't afraid, not yet. That would come later. Right then, I was hollow, like a building just cleared out. My thoughts echoed. My breath fogged the air in front of me. I opened the envelope and stared at the license. The corners were curling. The picture showed a woman with neatly brushed hair and eyes that believed things would get better. I didn't recognize her. Not really. The bus came 20 minutes late. The driver didn't ask questions. I sat near the back by the window and watched the world move past like a slideshow. Fast food signs, rusted fences, used car lots, chain-link yards with plastic toys half buried in mud. It was America, unchanged and unknowing. I didn't have a destination, just an address of a halfway house scratched on a card. I had 6 months to stay there. After that, I was on my own. Inside the bus, the heater rattled softly. I pressed my palm to the window. It was cold, the kind of cold that made your skin tingle, reminded you that you were still alive. When I arrived, the woman at the front desk handed me a set of rules: curfews, chores, mandatory meetings. She was polite but indifferent. I had become one of many, a placeholder in a system designed for recycling lives, not restoring them. My room was on the second floor: twin bed, metal frame, a dresser missing a drawer. The sheets smelled like detergent strong enough to burn your nose. I unpacked my things slowly: the toothbrush, the letters, the silent watch. I placed them on the dresser like relics. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. It was white, cracked in the corner. A spider had made a web near the light bulb, catching dust in the threads. I didn't cry. I didn't sleep. I just listened to the silence. And I thought about that door, the one that didn't creak, the one that opened so gently, so indifferently, that I couldn't even feel it close behind me. Long after the metal doors stopped closing behind me, long after the wristbands were cut and the uniforms folded into memory, the courtroom stayed with me. Not the real one, not the echoing federal chamber where I stood beside a lawyer I barely knew, nodding on cue and answering questions with words I'd rehearsed. No, the courtroom that lingered was the one I carried in my head. It built itself slowly, day by day, brick by silent brick, until it lived inside me as if it had always been there. I didn't have to close my eyes to see it. It would come without warning, while I stirred a pot of oatmeal at the halfway house, while I folded laundry in the communal dryer room, while I walked past strangers who didn't know what I had done or hadn't done. The walls were pale wood. The bench was high. I could hear the creak of the floorboards and the faint rustle of pages. There was a gavel, but it never struck. The trial in my mind never ended. It only replayed, shifting slightly each time, like a dream where the faces change, but the fear remains the same. In this courtroom, I sat both in the witness stand and at the defense table. I cross-examined myself. I objected and overruled. I presented exhibits made of memories. The paper I signed, the silence I accepted, the choice I made in a room where time stopped breathing. The prosecutor was not a man in a suit, but my own voice, sharpened, unrelenting, full of accusation. And the judge? The judge had my mother's eyes, my daughter's disappointment, and a face that aged as I watched it. Every morning, the trial resumed, quietly, relentlessly. It did not care if I had things to do, forms to fill, chores to complete. It began while I buttoned my shirt, while I sipped bitter coffee in a cracked ceramic mug. It whispered as I walked the sidewalks, as I passed the storefronts with mannequins in clothes I no longer recognized. Guilty, not of the crime, but of surrendering to a lie. I tried to quiet it. I volunteered at the shelter. I scrubbed floors until my knees ached. I planted marigolds in the dusty strip of soil behind the halfway house, hoping they would bloom in spite of the air, the noise, the weight. I went to meetings where women shared stories worse than mine, their voices trembling, their eyes proud. I told myself it could have been worse, that I had done what I needed to survive. But that courtroom didn't care about survival. It cared about the truth. And it asked me, again and again, why I had let it go. I answered differently each time. I was scared. I was exhausted. I didn't believe anyone would listen. I didn't want to die in prison. I didn't trust the system. I was manipulated. I was alone. I was practical. I was cornered. I was weak. Each answer echoed across the walls of my imagination and came back quieter than it had gone out. I began to avoid mirrors. Not out of shame exactly, but because the reflection was no longer trustworthy. I didn't look the same. There were lines where there hadn't been before, a tightness around my mouth, a guardedness in the eyes that no amount of rest could soften. I started cutting my own hair with scissors from the shared drawer. I wore plain clothes, neutral tones, like camouflage for someone with nowhere to hide. Once, I walked into a library and found a copy of the state penal code. I sat at a back table and flipped through the pages, not looking for anything in particular, just trying to feel the structure again. The cold, defined lines of law, the illusion of clarity. I found the section that matched my charge and read it over and over. The words had the same weight as the paper I had signed. Precise, inescapable, indifferent. Sometimes I thought about appealing. I even began writing a letter once to someone, anyone, maybe the Innocence Project or a pro bono attorney I'd read about. I described the timeline, the flaws in the evidence, the pressure, the deal. But halfway through, I tore it up. Not because it wasn't true, but because I realized I no longer wanted a legal reversal. What I wanted couldn't be filed in court. What I wanted was the past, a different choice, a second chance at that room, that moment, that signature. But those things belonged to a world that didn't exist anymore. The verdict in my head was never final, but it was always loud. On Sundays, I took the long walk to the river. It wound through a park lined with tired oaks and benches carved with initials. I would sit near the edge of the water and watch the current move. It didn't rush. It drifted, steady and indifferent, taking pieces of the world downstream, leaves, twigs, petals, time. I wondered if it could take memory too. If I stared long enough, maybe the courtroom inside me would loosen. Maybe the prosecutor would grow quiet. Maybe the judge would lower her gavel, not in judgment, but in rest. But the river never took it. Instead, it mirrored my silence. One afternoon, a boy threw a stone and broke the reflection. Ripples spread across the surface, and for a moment, I imagined they were reaching into me, unsettling the courtroom, scattering the exhibits. But when the ripples faded, the reflection returned, still fractured, still mine. I tried to explain it once, in a journal the counselor gave me. She told me writing could help. I wrote 3 pages, then burned them in a coffee can behind the house. The smoke smelled like ink and surrender. It didn't help, but watching the pages curl felt honest. I never told anyone about the courtroom. No one would have understood. They assumed I was free now. That time had been served and debts paid, but they didn't know that inside me, a trial was still in session. No breaks, no recesses, just the constant murmur of doubt and defense, guilt and reason, a verdict that rewrote itself every morning. Some days I imagined walking back into a real courtroom, standing tall and saying the words I had swallowed, not for the sake of justice, but for the sake of myself. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. The system had closed the case, the papers had been filed, the ink had dried. So I lived with the other court, the silent one, the one that didn't need bailiffs or transcripts, the one I couldn't leave behind. Redemption didn't come wrapped in light. It didn't arrive with applause or acknowledgement, didn't wait politely at my door, didn't knock or whisper. It simply grew, quietly, unceremoniously, like moss, like breath on a window pane. It came not in a grand gesture, but in the slow, unsteady repetition of small acts, folding a towel in the shelter laundry room, filling out forms for women who could barely spell their names, holding the silence between their tears without breaking it. I had been out for a year when I first began volunteering. It wasn't noble, it was necessary. The halfway house time had run out, and I had nowhere to go. A woman named Mrs. Henderson, with soft wrists and too many keys jangling at her waist, handed me a pamphlet for a transitional program that helped older women reintegrate. I went because the bus route was direct, and because I couldn't stomach another week of lying to temp agencies about gaps in my resume. The shelter was a low brick building on a street lined with cracked sidewalks and trees that leaned tiredly against chain link fences. It smelled like too much lemon disinfectant, and the faint rot of lives interrupted. The women who passed through wore mismatched clothes, carried plastic bags with all they had left, and walked like they were bracing for the next blow. I recognized the weight in their shoulders. I had carried it. At first, they didn't speak to me. I was older than most, quieter than all. I kept to my corner, organizing supply closets, labeling food in the fridge, mopping the same stretch of hallway until the tiles gleamed. No one thanked me. That was fine. I wasn't there to be seen. I had been seen enough by the system, by the papers, by the strangers who read my charge sheet and decided who I was. Weeks turned into months, and the place became familiar in the way forgotten spaces do. The tap in the second bathroom dripped every 17 seconds. The back door stuck in humidity. The clock above the main desk was always 5 minutes slow. I began to arrive early, just to sit alone in the office and breathe before the day began. One afternoon, a woman named Jasmine asked me for help filling out a benefits form. She had a black eye, a missing tooth, and a 3-year-old clinging to her hip like a life vest. I guided her hand slowly, letter by letter, box by box. She thanked me with her eyes. I didn't need the words. That was the first time I felt something loosen in my chest. I wasn't a savior. I wasn't healed, but I was present. The days bled into each other, the way prison time once had. But now, instead of counting the hours between lockdowns, I counted gestures. How many clean bed sheets folded, how many donated shoes paired correctly, how many times I listened without flinching when a woman told me how she ended up here. Drugs, men, poverty, lies, the machinery of survival grinding through skin and bone until nothing remained but breath and a name. They never asked about my story. Sometimes I imagined telling it. Most times I didn't. Not because I was ashamed. Shame had long calcified into something else, denial maybe, or a kind of numb practicality. But because I had learned that stories, when spoken aloud, were no longer yours. They became objects passed around, dissected, misunderstood. My story had been taken once by a prosecutor. I had no wish to offer it up again. Instead, I wrote. At night, in the small room I rented behind a laundromat, I wrote letters I would never send. To the woman I used to be, to the prosecutor, to the judge, to my daughter. I addressed them all the same way. You don't know the whole story. I ended them with the same phrase. But I do. I burned some of them in a ceramic bowl on the windowsill. The ashes blew out like dust, like breath, like apology. Sometimes I lit candles with no scent, just flame. I watched the wax drip and thought about erosion, about how even stone gives way to water with enough time. I wasn't a stone anymore. I wasn't a record in a file cabinet. I was a woman in a room with a notebook and a match, trying to understand what it meant to continue. One day, I passed by the courthouse, not the one I had stood in, but another, in a different part of the city. I stood across the street for almost an hour, just watching. People entered and exited. some nervous, some numb, some holding manila folders with their futures inside. No one looked up, no one saw me, and for the first time, I didn't want them to. I walked home slowly, taking side streets, passing closed bookstores and shuttered diners, breathing in the air that still carried spring in its folds. I passed a church with a cracked bell and a rusted sign that read, "You are not your mistake." I stopped and stared at it, the words blurry behind my watering eyes. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. The message had already found me. Redemption, I realized, wasn't a curtain rising. It wasn't applause. It wasn't an article saying the system got it wrong, or a phone call from someone ready to say sorry. Redemption was folding a child's donated sweater and placing it gently into a plastic bin. It was handing a woman a bar of soap and seeing her shoulders soften. It was waking up and not crying. It was silence that no longer accused. And it was mine, not declared, not granted, but claimed, quietly, fully, without a stage,